Rachel Thompson adjusted her noise-canceling headphones and settled into seat 17A, her oversized university sweatshirt concealing the athletic build that years of military training had developed. To her fellow passengers on United Flight 847, she was just another 26-year-old traveler maybe, a graduate student or social media influencer who preferred quiet observation to constant digital chatter. The Boeing 737-800 had departed Denver International Airport precisely on schedule, bound for Raleigh-Durham with 137 passengers and 6 crew members. Everything seemed routine as Rachel maintained her deliberately unremarkable presence, eyes half closed in what appeared to be meditation or light sleep. What her fellow passengers didn't know was that Rachel's casual appearance was carefully cultivated. No makeup, no jewelry, no smartphone constantly in hand, nothing that might draw unwanted attention. Her well-worn running shoes suggested regular exercise, but nothing specialized. She simply existed in peaceful solitude, exactly as she preferred. Lead flight attendant Sandra Martinez had noticed Rachel during pre-flight boarding, but only because of a small notation in her crew manifest that most passengers never saw. Row 17 carried a special passenger code that appeared perhaps once or twice a year on commercial flights, a designation that meant someone with unique qualifications was aboard, someone who preferred anonymity but whose presence was quietly acknowledged by those who needed to know. The first 52 minutes of flight proceeded without incident. Weather conditions were optimal. Conversation among passengers was light, and the cabin crew moved through their service routines with practiced efficiency. Rachel remained motionless in her window seat, appearing to doze while actually maintaining the heightened awareness that military training had ingrained in her. Then came the sharp metallic pop that reverberated through the aircraft structure. Most passengers dismissed it as thermal expansion or normal mechanical settling, but Rachel's eyes snapped open instantly. A subtle vibration began transmitting through the cabin floor, almost imperceptible to untrained senses, but triggering every instinct she developed during years of military aviation training. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The businessman across the aisle from Rachel was still absorbed in his laptop, completely oblivious to the signs that were screaming danger to someone with her background. The family behind her continued their quiet conversation about vacation plans. Even the flight attendants seemed unaware that their routine flight was about to become anything but routine. Rachel's trained ear detected the subtle change in engine harmonics that preceded the starboard engine's complete failure. She was already mentally running through emergency protocols when the cabin lights flickered ominously and several sections went completely dark. The collective gasp of 137 passengers filled the aircraft as the plane's smooth flight characteristics suddenly changed to an alarming downward trajectory. Children began crying. Adults gripped their armrests with white knuckles. The port engine began producing irregular sounds, sputtering and losing power in a pattern that Rachel recognized as imminent total failure. As oxygen masks deployed and emergency lighting activated along the aisles, Rachel calmly removed her headphones and folded them with practiced efficiency. She had been hoping for a quiet, unremarkable flight to visit her sister in North Carolina. Instead, she was about to become the only thing standing between 143 people and catastrophe. The barely controlled voice from the cockpit crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing complete systems failure. Please remain seated with seatbelts secured while we assess our options." Rachel watched Sandra Martinez unbuckle from her jump seat and begin moving urgently down the center aisle, not toward the cockpit, as most flight attendants would in an emergency, but directly toward row 17. Their eyes met, and Rachel saw the mixture of hope and desperation in the experienced flight attendant's face. "Ma'am in the window seat," Sandra called out. her voice carrying across the cabin filled with frightened passengers. "We need you in the cockpit immediately." Every passenger within hearing distance turned to stare at the quiet young woman who had spent the entire flight in complete anonymity. Rachel could see the confusion and skepticism in their faces, could almost hear their thoughts. What could she possibly do to help? She was about to show them exactly what years of military aviation training, countless hours in high-stress environments, and nerves of steel could accomplish when everything else had failed. The businessman across the aisle voiced what many passengers were thinking. What? Her? She probably thinks the cockpit is just another TikTok recording studio. Another passenger added his skeptical assessment. They're seriously sending some college kid up front to help with this emergency. This is insane. Rachel had heard similar dismissive comments throughout her military career. Her youthful appearance and deliberately casual demeanor had always prompted underestimation from those who didn't know her background. But this wasn't a training exercise or a peacetime evaluation. This was a crisis where 143 lives hung in the balance. She stood with the measured composure of someone accessing familiar muscle memory rather than responding to unprecedented crisis. Without displaying panic, confusion, or desperate eagerness, she handed her small carry-on bag to the passenger beside her and nodded acknowledgement to Sandra. "This is ridiculous," muttered a middle-aged executive several rows back. "What's next? Asking if anyone's played flight simulator games." The dismissive laughter that rippled through the cabin died quickly as passengers realized their situation was deteriorating rapidly. The aircraft continued losing altitude, and the irregular engine sounds were becoming more pronounced. Whatever was happening in the cockpit, it wasn't going well. Rachel began walking toward the front of the aircraft with the steady gait of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. Her movements were controlled and purposeful, nothing like the uncertain shuffle of a civilian passenger being thrust into an impossible situation. But the skepticism followed her down the aisle. "I can't believe they're trusting our lives to some random girl," whispered a woman traveling with her teenage daughter. "Where are the real pilots? Why isn't anyone with actual training taking control?" The comment stung more than Rachel would ever admit. She had spent years proving herself in military aviation, earning respect through competence and dedication. She had instructor certifications, thousands of flight hours, and experience in crisis management that few pilots ever accumulated. But to these passengers, she was just another young woman who couldn't possibly possess the skills needed to save their lives. Sandra Martinez had reached the cockpit door and was gesturing urgently for Rachel to hurry. Through the open doorway, Rachel could see the chaos inside. First Officer Williams unconscious, Captain Rodriguez struggling with the controls while fighting the effects of oxygen deprivation. "Ma'am, I need to ask," Sandra said quietly as Rachel approached. "Are you really qualified for this? Because if you're not, we need to find someone else immediately." Even the flight attendant, who had been specifically instructed to locate the passenger in seat 17 was expressing doubt about Rachel's abilities. The institutional sexism and ageism that had followed her throughout her career was now potentially putting everyone's lives at risk. "I understand your concern," Rachel replied calmly, "but right now, I'm the most qualified pilot you're going to find at 30,000 feet. Behind her, she could hear passengers continuing their skeptical commentary. Some were demanding to know why the flight crew wasn't handling the emergency themselves. Others were questioning whether anyone had actually verified Rachel's credentials before allowing her into the cockpit. The doubt and dismissal were familiar burdens, but they had never carried such deadly consequences. Rachel had to succeed not just to prove herself, but to save every person aboard the aircraft. The weight of their skepticism added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. As she stepped into the cockpit, Rachel pushed aside the sting of their dismissive comments, and focused on the critical task ahead. She would have to perform flawlessly while knowing that every passenger behind her was questioning her right to be there. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same people who were disparaging her qualifications would soon owe their lives to the skills they refused to believe she possessed. The cockpit presented a scene of barely controlled chaos that would have overwhelmed most civilian passengers. First Officer Williams lay unconscious, his face pale from oxygen deprivation after secondary electrical systems had shorted out. Captain Rodriguez remained semi-conscious, his hands gripping the control yoke with desperate determination while clearly fighting the effects of hypoxia. Rachel entered the cramped flight deck with confident familiarity, immediately assessing the situation with trained eyes. Without hesitation, she reached across the instrument panel and deactivated the emergency autopilot override that had been fighting against manual control inputs, instantly stabilizing the aircraft's erratic flight path. "Ma'am, who exactly are you?" Sandra asked breathlessly, her voice carrying hope and bewilderment at this unexpected development. "Rachel Thompson," she responded matter-of-factly while her hands continued working through emergency checklist procedures. "Former Air National Guard, 139th Airlift Wing, C-130 flight instructor specializing in emergency operations. 4 years of intensive crisis management training. Current civilian pilot certification with multi-engine commercial endorsement." Sandra's eyes widened with sudden understanding and relief. "You're actually a qualified pilot?" "At 30,000 feet with total engine failure, I'm the most qualified pilot you're going to find," Rachel replied, her attention never wavering from the critical task of aircraft systems assessment. But even as she spoke, Rachel could hear the continuing skepticism from the passenger cabin. Through the open cockpit door, voices carried forward passengers, still questioning whether someone who looked like a college student could possibly handle their emergency. "How we know she's telling the truth?" demanded the businessman who had been so dismissive earlier. "Anyone can claim to be a pilot. Where's her identification? Where are her credentials?" A flight attendant in the back of the cabin was trying to calm passengers, but the doubt was spreading. "She's just a young woman," someone whispered. "How can we trust our lives to someone who looks like she should be in a classroom, not a cockpit?" The skepticism was becoming a secondary crisis. Rachel needed the passengers to remain calm and follow instructions, but their lack of confidence in her abilities was creating additional chaos during a situation that required absolute focus and precision. Even worse, she could hear some passengers demanding that the flight crew find anyone else to take control. A man claimed to have played flight simulator games and volunteered to help. A woman insisted her husband had taken flying lessons and might be more qualified than some random girl. Rachel's jaw tightened as she worked to restore hydraulic pressure to critical flight control surfaces. The commentary from the cabin was becoming a distraction she couldn't afford, but she understood their fear. They were looking at her youthful appearance and casual clothing, not seeing the years of military training and experience that had prepared her for exactly this moment. Captain Rodriguez stirred slightly, his eyes focusing on Rachel with growing recognition. You're 139th Airlift Wing," he mumbled through his oxygen mask. "I know your reputation. You're the instructor who trained the emergency descent specialists." His words carried back to the cabin, where passengers caught fragments of the conversation. The businessman who had been so skeptical suddenly looked uncertain. The woman who had questioned Rachel's qualifications fell silent, but doubt dies hard, especially when lives are at stake. Rachel could still hear whispered conversations questioning whether they should really trust their survival to someone who looked so young and inexperienced. She established a supplemental oxygen flow to the captain's position and engaged manual trim control systems, her movements precise and efficient. Every action demonstrated the competence that her appearance had concealed. But she knew she would have to prove herself completely before some passengers would accept her authority. The aircraft was responding to her control inputs, stabilizing despite the complete loss of engine power. Rachel used her knowledge of regional geography and prevailing wind patterns to calculate an optimal emergency glide slope, maximizing their altitude retention and distance coverage. "She's actually stabilizing our flight path," Sandra whispered. To another crew member, amazement filling her voice. "The aircraft is responding to her control inputs." Throughout the passenger compartment, the crew jokes and dismissive comments began to disappear as people realized their situation was improving. The plane was no longer dropping erratically. The emergency was being managed with systematic precision. But Rachel knew the real test was still ahead. She had to execute a dead-stick landing with no engine power, and she had to do it while proving to 143 skeptical passengers that their lives were in capable hands. Air traffic control at Greensboro Piedmont Triad International Airport had already initiated full emergency protocols after losing radio contact with Flight 847's original crew. Emergency vehicles were positioning themselves along potential approach vectors, while controllers attempted to establish communication with whoever might be managing the aircraft's emergency situation. Rachel reached for the radio microphone. With steady hands, her voice cutting through the static with professional clarity that immediately commanded attention throughout the control facility. "Greensboro Tower, this is Rachel Thompson assuming piloting command responsibilities for Flight 847 due to crew incapacitation. Aircraft experiencing complete dual-engine failure with partial systems functionality remaining. Requesting emergency vectors and priority clearance for dead-stick approach." The primary controller froze at his station, his hand hovering over response controls as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. "Flight 847, did you say Rachel Thompson? Please confirm pilot identification and qualifications." Before Rachel could respond, a different voice broke into the emergency frequency with unmistakable authority. "Greensboro Tower, this is Commander Michael Reynolds, 139th Airlift Wing Operations. Rachel Thompson is confirmed qualified for emergency command authority. Provide her with full cooperation and any assistance she requires. She has my complete authorization." A moment of stunned silence fell over the control center as controllers processed this unprecedented intervention from Military Aviation Command. Then came the response that would clear the way for what followed. "Flight 847, you are cleared for unrestricted emergency approach. You have absolute priority for all airspace and runway access. Fire and rescue crews are standing by. Back in the passenger cabin." Word of the radio exchange had spread quickly. The businessman who had been so skeptical earlier was now leaning forward in his seat, straining to hear updates from the cockpit. The woman who had questioned Rachel's qualifications was gripping her armrests, her earlier dismissive comments replaced by anxious hope. But it was the conversation between two passengers in row 12 that crystallized the breaking point everyone felt. "Did you hear that? Military command just vouched for her. She's the real deal." "I feel terrible," the other passenger replied. "We were ready to dismiss her as some college kid playing hero. She's actually qualified to save our lives." The shift in cabin atmosphere was palpable. Passengers who had been voicing skepticism just minutes earlier now watched the cockpit area with quiet confidence. The doubt that had plagued the first part of the emergency was being replaced by growing recognition that their survival depended on someone whose qualifications extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. Rachel's hands moved across the instrument panel with fluid efficiency that comes only from extensive training and real-world experience under pressure. She compensated for the loss of engine power by optimizing the aircraft's aerodynamic configuration, adjusting wing flaps and control surfaces to achieve maximum glide performance. "Captain Rodriguez, I need you to stay with me," she said to the semi-conscious pilot. "We're going to execute a dead stick landing, but I need your help with checklist verification." The captain's response was weak but clear. "Roger that. You have ... You have my complete confidence." Those words carried back to the passenger cabin, where the transformation in atmosphere became complete. The same people who had questioned Rachel's abilities now understood that their emergency was being handled by someone whose credentials had been personally verified by Military Aviation Command. A child who had been crying earlier had gone quiet, sensing the calm confidence that now emanated from the cockpit. Parents who had been struggling to maintain composure were finding strength in the professional competence they could hear in Rachel's voice. But Rachel knew the hardest part was still ahead. Radio confirmation and military endorsement meant nothing if she couldn't execute a perfect dead stick landing. She had to bring 143 people safely to the ground using only gravitational energy and her knowledge of aerodynamics. The Greensboro runway complex was becoming visible through the cockpit windscreen, and Rachel began the complex process of configuring the powerless aircraft for what would essentially be a controlled crash. Landing. Every calculation had to be perfect. Every control input had to be precise. Behind her, 143 passengers sat in respectful silence, their earlier skepticism replaced by the understanding that their lives were in the most capable hands possible under the circumstances. The breaking point had passed. Now came the test that would determine whether everyone aboard would survive to tell the story of the quiet young woman who had seemed so ordinary until the moment when extraordinary skills became the difference between life and death. Rachel's systematic approach to the emergency landing began with manual adjustment of flap settings to optimize lift-to-drag ratios. She coordinated airspeed management using only gravitational energy, calculating approach angles using backup altimeter readings and visual reference points. Greensboro Tower, Flight 847, is established on final approach vector. She transmitted with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her entire management of the crisis. Estimate touchdown in approximately 4 minutes. All souls aboard are secure and prepared for emergency landing. The response came immediately. Flight 847, you are cleared to land. Emergency crews are in position and ready to assist. Winds are calm, visibility unlimited. You have our complete support. Rachel could hear the air traffic controller's voice carrying a mixture of professional composure and personal investment in her success. Everyone on the ground was pulling for the young woman who had stepped up when the impossible had become necessary. In the passenger cabin, the transformation was complete. The businessman who had initially questioned her qualifications was now watching the cockpit with obvious respect. "She's actually going to do it," he whispered to his seatmate. "She's going to land this aircraft without engines." The woman who had worried about trusting their lives to someone so young was now watching Rachel's every movement with admiration. "I've never seen anyone handle pressure like this," she murmured. "She's completely calm." But Rachel's internal experience was far from calm. She was drawing on every hour of training, every simulation, every emergency procedure she had ever practiced. The weight of 143 lives was a pressure unlike anything she had experienced in military service, where emergency situations typically involved smaller crews and trained personnel. The aircraft's descent was masterfully controlled, despite the complete absence of engine power. Rachel treated the powerless Boeing 737 like a massive glider, using every principle of aerodynamics and energy management she had learned during years of military training. "Captain Rodriguez, I need you to call out our altitude and airspeed," she requested, her voice steady despite the incredible complexity of what she was attempting. The semi-conscious captain rallied his remaining strength. Altitude 2,000 feet, airspeed 130 knots. Looking good, Rachel. You're flying this aircraft like you were born to it. His words of encouragement carried throughout the cabin, where passengers could hear the growing confidence in their situation. The same people who had questioned Rachel's abilities were now witnessing a textbook demonstration of skill under pressure. Sandra Martinez moved through the cabin, checking that passengers were properly secured for landing. The pilot says we're looking good for a safe landing, she announced. Everyone please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. The pilot, whispered the businessman to his neighbor. Not the girl or the young woman, the pilot. She's earned that respect. Rachel's hands remained remarkably steady as she made final adjustments to the aircraft's configuration. She had calculated the optimal touchdown point on the runway, factoring in their current glide slope, wing conditions, and the aircraft's weight distribution. The runway approached at exactly the angle and airspeed she had calculated. Every passenger could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their flashing lights a reminder of the seriousness of their situation, but they could also sense the controlled precision with which Rachel was managing their approach. 1,000 feet, Captain Rodriguez called out. Airspeed 1 to 5 knots. Perfect approach angle. Rachel's response was barely audible but carried absolute confidence. We're bringing everyone home safely today. The ground was rising to meet them, and Rachel's years of training were about to be tested in the most demanding circumstances any pilot could face. But the doubt and skepticism that had plagued the first part of the emergency had been replaced by something more powerful. Complete trust in the skills of someone who had proven herself when it mattered most. The fight back wasn't just about landing the aircraft. It was about proving that competence exists in unexpected places, that qualifications matter more than appearances, and that the quiet professionals around us often possess exactly the skills we need when crisis strikes. The main landing gear contacted the runway surface at precisely 124 knots, dead center of the runway centerline with minimal vertical impact force that protected both aircraft structure and passenger safety. Rachel's months of dead-stick landing. Practice in military simulators had prepared her for this moment, but the reality of executing it with 143 lives at stake was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The aircraft rolled down the runway using only aerodynamic braking and mechanical wheel friction. Rachel's hands steady on the controls as she maintained directional control without engine power or full hydraulic systems. The Boeing 737 came to a complete stop approximately 2/3 down the runway length. A textbook emergency landing that would be studied in aviation training programs for years to come. The moment the aircraft's wheels stopped rolling, the cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers who had questioned Rachel's qualifications just 30 minutes earlier were now clapping with tears in their eyes, their skepticism completely replaced by gratitude and amazement. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel's voice came over the intercom system, still calm and professional, despite having just accomplished the impossible. Welcome to Greensboro. Please remain seated until the cabin crew indicates it's safe to move. You've all been incredibly brave during this emergency. The businessman across from her original seat was shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe what I just witnessed, he said to anyone who would listen. She saved every single one of us, and I was ready to dismiss her as some college kid. The woman traveling with her teenage daughter was crying openly. I'm so ashamed of what I said earlier. She's a hero, and I treated her like she didn't belong here. As cabin doors were opened by ground crews, the tarmac filled with emergency responders, medical personnel, Federal Aviation Administration investigators, and media representatives who had monitored the emergency radio traffic. But remarkably, No one approached Rachel requesting identification verification or credentials documentation. Every aviation professional present, from air traffic controllers to emergency response coordinators, simply nodded with the respect accorded to someone whose performance had spoken louder than any documentation could have provided. Captain Rodriguez, now fully conscious and receiving medical attention, made sure to speak with the FAA investigators first. "That young woman saved everyone aboard this aircraft," he told them. "I've been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years, and I've never seen emergency procedures executed with such precision under pressure." First Officer Williams, who had regained consciousness during the landing, added his testimony. "She handled systems that most pilots only see in simulator training. Her competence was absolutely flawless." But it was the passenger testimonials that would prove most damaging to those who had doubted Rachel's abilities. The businessman who had made the TikTok comment found himself speaking to news reporters. "I need to publicly apologize for my initial reaction. I let stereotypes and assumptions cloud my judgment about someone who turned out to be the most qualified person on that aircraft." The woman who had questioned Rachel's qualifications was even more direct. "I was wrong, completely wrong. I judged her by her appearance instead of trusting that the flight crew knew what they were doing. She saved my life and my daughter's life, and I treated her with disrespect." National news outlets were already covering the incident extensively. "Unidentified woman successfully lands commercial airliner after complete engine failure" became the standard headline across major networks and aviation publications worldwide. Television footage showed Rachel stepping down the aircraft stairs, hood pulled up over her head, eyes focused straight ahead, moving with the same unremarkable composure she had maintained throughout the crisis. To casual observers, she appeared to be just another passenger grateful to have survived a frightening experience. But within military aviation communities and professional pilot networks, her name was circulating with the kind of respect reserved for individuals whose competence had been demonstrated under the most demanding circumstances possible. Comments appeared on restricted aviation forums accessible only to certified military and commercial pilots. "Rachel Thompson used to train our emergency descent instructors at the 139th. Her simulation performance records were legendary." The downfall wasn't Rachel's. It was the downfall of every assumption, every stereotype, every dismissive comment that had been made about her capabilities. The people who had doubted her were now confronting the reality that their lives had been saved by someone they had refused to take seriously. 1 week after the emergency landing, Rachel discovered an envelope that had been hand-delivered to her apartment address, not through normal postal service, but by someone with access to her personal information through military channels. The correspondence wasn't from United Airlines, FAA investigators, or media representatives seeking interviews about her actions. Instead, it contained a brief handwritten note on official military letterhead. "Rachel, some pilots fly with official clearance and regulatory authorization. You fly with something more valuable: absolute certainty and unshakable competence under pressure. You're cleared for any airspace, any time, any conditions. Respectfully, Commander Michael Reynolds, 139th Airlift Wing." But the real climax came during a special ceremony that Rachel had initially tried to avoid. The FAA had insisted on a formal recognition event, and despite her preference for anonymity, the agency had made it clear that her actions deserved public acknowledgement. The ceremony took place at the Greensboro Airport, in the same terminal where her emergency landing had occurred. Present were the passengers from Flight 847, aviation officials, military representatives, and media from across the country. Rachel stood at the podium, still uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that her story had become larger than her personal preference for privacy. In the audience sat many of the passengers who had initially doubted her abilities. their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and shame. The businessman who had made the TikTok comment stood up during the question period. "Ms. Thompson, I need to apologize publicly for my initial reaction to your involvement in our emergency. I let stereotypes and prejudice cloud my judgment about someone who turned out to be the most qualified person on that aircraft. You saved my life, and I treated you with disrespect." The woman who had questioned whether they should trust a college kid with their lives was in tears as she spoke. "I was wrong about you from the moment I saw you. I judged you by your appearance and age instead of trusting that you were exactly who we needed. You're a hero, and I'm ashamed of how I reacted." One by one, passengers who had expressed skepticism during the emergency stood to offer their apologies and gratitude. The same people who had whispered doubts about Rachel's qualifications were now acknowledging that their lives had been saved by someone whose competence they had refused to recognize. Captain Rodriguez, now fully recovered, delivered the most powerful testimony. "In 22 years of commercial aviation, I've never witnessed emergency procedures executed with such precision under pressure." Rachel Thompson didn't just save 143 lives. She demonstrated that competence and qualifications matter more than appearance or age. The FIA administrator, presenting Rachel with the Exceptional Service Award, spoke directly to the broader implications of her story. This incident reminds us that heroism often comes in unexpected packages. Ms. Thompson's actions demonstrate that we must never let assumptions about age, gender, or appearance cloud our recognition of genuine competence. Rachel's acceptance speech was brief but powerful. "I didn't save Flight 847 to prove a point about stereotypes or assumptions. I saved it because I had the training and experience necessary to handle the emergency." But I hope this incident reminds everyone that competence exists in many forms. And the person sitting quietly beside you might possess exactly the skills you need when crisis strikes. The applause was thunderous and sustained. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came afterward, when the passengers from Flight 847 approached Rachel individually to express their gratitude and acknowledge their initial misjudgments. The businessman shook her hand with obvious emotion. "Thank you for saving our lives despite how we treated you. You're a better person than I am." The woman with the teenage daughter was crying as she hugged Rachel. "My daughter is alive because of you. I'll never forget what you did, and I'll never again judge someone by their appearance." The climax wasn't just about recognition, it was about the complete transformation of perspective among people who had learned the most important lesson of their lives. That quiet competence often exists exactly where we least expect to find it. 6 months after the emergency landing, Rachel noticed an interesting pattern in her subsequent commercial flight experiences. Every time she booked airline tickets for personal or professional travel, Row 17 mysteriously remained available, never assigned to other passengers, never blocked for operational reasons, never unavailable due to overbooking or aircraft configuration changes. The seat remained open quietly, without explanation or fanfare. Flight crews seemed to recognize her name during check-in procedures, though they never made direct comments about her background or the emergency landing that had made her legendary within aviation circles. Gate agents would ensure she had priority, awarding privileges without being asked. Air traffic controllers at various airports began recognizing her voice during private pilot communications, maintaining professional protocols while providing her with expedited clearances and preferred routing. The aviation community had quietly acknowledged that some people earned their place in the sky through demonstrated competence rather than bureaucratic credentials, and that the most valuable qualifications are those proven under pressure when lives depend on performance rather than paperwork. Rachel returned to her quiet life, but she carried with her the knowledge that her actions had changed more than just the outcome of one emergency flight. The passengers from Flight 847 had become advocates for looking beyond appearances and assumptions, sharing their story as a reminder that competence comes in unexpected packages. The businessman who had initially doubted her abilities had become a frequent speaker at diversity and inclusion seminars, using his experience to illustrate how unconscious bias can blind us to the capabilities of those around us. "I nearly died because I was more concerned with how someone looked than with what they could do," he would tell audiences. Don't make the same mistake I did. The woman who had questioned Rachel's qualifications had started a blog about challenging assumptions and recognizing unsung heroes in everyday life. Her first post, titled "The Pilot in Row 17, had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Captain Rodriguez had requested Rachel as a co-pilot for his flights whenever possible, telling airline officials that she was the most competent aviator he had ever worked with. Age and appearance mean nothing when you're at 30,000 feet, he would say. Skill and composure are what matter. The FAA had quietly revised their emergency response protocols to ensure that qualified personnel aboard aircraft would be identified and utilized more effectively during crisis situations. Rachel's experience had highlighted gaps in the system that could have prevented her from being recognized as a resource during the emergency. But perhaps the most significant change was in Rachel herself. She had always preferred anonymity, but she now understood that her visibility mattered to others who might face similar skepticism and dismissal. She began accepting speaking engagements at aviation conferences and military training facilities, sharing her story not for personal recognition, but to encourage others to look beyond superficial judgments. "Competence doesn't announce itself," she would tell audiences. "It simply performs when called upon." The quiet professional sitting beside you might possess exactly the skills you need when everything else fails. Rachel's story had become more than an account of one emergency landing. It had become a reminder that heroism often exists in the most unexpected places, waiting quietly for the moment when extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary response. The passengers of Flight 847 had learned that lesson at 30,000 feet, and they carried it with them for the rest of their lives. A reminder to never again let assumptions about age, gender, or appearance prevent them from recognizing genuine competence when they encountered it. Rachel Thompson had saved 143 lives not just through her piloting skills, but through her demonstration that the most valuable qualifications are often carried by those who need neither recognition nor validation to perform at their highest level when it matters most. Row 17 would always be available for her, but more importantly, the world had learned to save a seat for quiet competence wherever it might be found. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.